Aloha from the East-West Center in Honolulu, and mahalo to viewers around the world for tuning into today's webinars presented by the East-West Center Seminars Live on the future of media. Our East-West Seminars Live series is designed for multinational journalists and inform their audiences to connect, inform, and source media stories. My name is Marilyn Lee, a program coordinator here at the center. It is my pleasure and honor to introduce today's distinguished media experts and innovators speaking about how journalists and news organizations can best prepare, transform themselves to succeed in a post-pandemic media environment. We are sorry to inform you Heiko Fahim is unable to join us today due to personal emergency. But we are grateful and delighted to have Tim Williamson to take Heiko's place. Tim, Managing Director at Tulum Media, the leading media relations platform for the Asia-Pacific region, has more than 20 years experience in broadcast journalism and corporate communications in the UK, Australia, and Asia. He will offer rich insights into media employment trends. Rama Mawaya, the founder and CEO of Daily Social in Jakarta, is Indonesia's leading technology innovator. Rama specializes in business analytics and intelligence, digital marketing, management, product development, strategy, leadership, and finance. He is passionate about digital transformation, startups, and tech entrepreneurship. With no advertising revenue, Rama still built a successful community-based company. Rama is an East-West Center alum, participated in the 2011 New Generation Seminar. Anita Zelina is the Director of Strategic Initiatives at the Craig Newmark Graduate School of Journalism at the City University of New York. She works with her staff to develop and market revenue-generating opportunities. Anita, an experienced digital media executive with a focus on digital transformation, change processes, and innovation management, was the first Austrian journalist selected for the Knight Journalism Fellowship at Stanford University, dedicated to entrepreneurship, innovation, and leadership in journalism. Finally, it's my pleasure and honor to introduce today's moderator, Alan Thun, co-founder at Spice Media in Singapore. A career journalist for 2 decades, Alan has worked in radio, television, newswires, magazine, and online across Asia, giving him unique insight into how various newsrooms get things done. We are so honored that Alan has spoken at several of the East-West Center International Media Conferences. Their full bio are on our website, eastwestcenter.org/EWC Seminars Live. I would like to take a moment now to share our webinar protocol. Today's webinar is on the record, recorded live on Zoom and made available on YouTube for viewing and sharing. Viewers, your microphone and videos are turned off. Each panelist will present his/her perspective in response to moderator-driven questions. Q&A will take place after panelists' interactive discussion. You can submit your question by using the Q&A tab at the bottom of your Zoom screen throughout the webinar. We will address as many questions as time allows. Join the conversation on Twitter using hashtag EWC Seminars Live and follow us on Twitter and Instagram at EWC Seminars. Check our website for webinar information, registration, full speaker bios, and YouTube links at eastwestcenter.org/EWC Seminars Live. From there, you can also access information about other professional opportunities as the center offers a diverse array of media, leadership, and educational programs. Without further delay, I'm handing the program over to Alan.
Good morning, everybody from Singapore. It's 9:07 here. Nice start to the day. Thank you to the East West Center, and thank you, Marilyn, for the kind comments and introducing the panel here. This is something that I've been looking forward to just because it's a nice way to wrap up what's been a really big year for media so far. If you've just joined us, we're talking here today about the future of media, where this year and the trends that it's created would take us into next year is what we want to get to. We're going to be talking about how journalists and news organizations can best prepare and transform themselves to succeed when all of this pandemic stuff is over and done with. We have about 46 attendees right now on the on Zoom, which is really great to see. I see a lot of familiar names in there as well. So thank you so much for taking the time to join us this morning. Leave your questions in the chat box. We will take them as we go. We like to keep things very informal here. I mean, the best way to learn is to talk informally often. So please just leave your comments in there, leave your questions in the chat box. Feel free to reach out to the speakers as well. I've added their LinkedIn profiles in the chat box so that you can have a look at that and see the wonderful careers that they've all had. So let me just quickly start. So the way I'm going to do this is just to run a very informal conversation among three very, very high esteemed professionals in this space, people who've seen a lot go on, especially in a year like this, people who have very strong opinions about where things will go next year. So why don't we start off with a very simple question here, and let's go to Anita for this one. Anita, we've seen a lot of comments that this year is a hard reset for media. Do you agree with this?
Well, I mean, this year is obviously a harder reset than the already kind of happening resets over the last few years. The interesting thing, I think, and many of us working in or with news organizations will have experienced that throughout 2020, is that what happened through COVID and what happened through the economic crisis that hit journalism as a side effect of COVID, is that some trends that were already there have been accelerated. Trends that the existing media business models were declining rapidly. Trends that show that consumption behavior and user patterns are changing drastically and moving towards online and mobile in obviously now a way more accelerated speed because everyone's like at home with their digital platforms and digital tools. And then obviously also what we've seen in the US, in Europe, in Asia is through the economic crisis brought on through COVID and accelerated through COVID, we've seen a lot of layoffs, a lot of mergers between large media organizations that weren't entirely voluntary. We saw some media organizations disappear, and that I'm sure we haven't seen the end of that. So that is going to continue. So what I will say is that it's been a rough year for journalism. It's also been an interesting year for journalism. I will say that there are some trends that we see that I think are promising and that I hope we will dive into later in this conversation.
Absolutely. Yeah, we'll get into those trends down the line, but I just wanted to also kind of just bring in Tim to the conversation as well. Tim, do you also believe that this has been a hard reset for media this year?
I think that there has certainly been an acceleration of some compounding trends that have been impacting media. We've seen that, and the acute kind of withdrawal of more advertising has certainly hit certain segments of media. So yes, in that sense, there has been a hard reset. The Talent Media sort of tracks movements, as you know, where journalists are going to, it connects PR professionals and journalists. And when I look at the activity within the media outlets, we would see spike activity through this year, which would be exactly to the point Anita made, where large media organizations were laying people off. We've also seen periods through the year where actually there's been relatively little movement between media organizations. And you can imagine that's where people are hanging on. They're not looking for the next career opportunity. And I'd have to say that we seem to be out of the woods, at least in the Asia Pacific region. In that context, we've seen within the last month a significant amount of movement, and a lot of that is people moving from one place to another. And we're also seeing a lot of jobs being advertised, so it's not entirely a black and white picture. The second component to that, I would say, is that we track movements in media, and that includes new media organizations. So whilst we have seen these big layoffs, the total number of media organizations that we follow has increased, but a lot of those are micro media organizations. They're podcasts, they're bloggers, they're digital platforms. So again, an acceleration in an already happening trend, the digitization of media and the accessibility that brings, bringing lots more very small media outlets. And that's very interesting to see. And it's pretty much across all of the Asia Pacific region.
I'm glad you mentioned micro media players out there. I think that's something I want to get down to later on, because it's something that's very close to my heart, as you can imagine. It's also something that I think will drive the transformation of this industry. So Rama, if I could pull you in now, Rama, you've been in the entrepreneurial space for over a decade. You've seen good times and bad times. This is not new, is it?
Yeah, it's definitely not the latest, hype basically, but it is one of the hardest times for I think any media company in the region, globally, in fact. So yeah, I think I totally agree with Tim and Anita's point as well when it comes to hard reset. In a traditional sense, there's a lot of hard reset going around, but it also accelerates, what Tim calls the micro media organizations. I think that's exactly what I feel as well. Especially in Indonesia, where I'm based, lots of new media companies starting out as a podcast, as a YouTube, and now I think TikTok is kind of the one of the latest trend. Probably like 6 months ago, I could never imagine of a TikTok influencer with lots of followers can be like a media company, but it actually happens now. A network of influencers from TikTok and Instagram, and they're becoming more and more influential, and they are becoming a valid organization with partnership with corporations. I think it's an
Great. So, if we could just kind of double down on that point about influencers, right? This is something that's close to my heart as well, just because I think that this is a trend that we've seen over the last 5 years. Or actually, you can even take it further back, right? I remember when YouTubers became a thing for the first time, and all of us journalists were like, oh, wait a minute, they're not like us. Their production quality isn't like us. They have jump cuts from from one scene to another. They don't know how to do it like us. Where do you think that conversation is in a year like this right now? Is it time to finally break that ice or that mold and ask ourselves, what is it that we do as journalists that makes us different? Tim.
I share a perspective on this, because I think we try and draw a distinction here and it's quite a difficult distinction to make sometimes. We follow pitchable media outlets, if you like. So that's media outlets that have a degree of editorial, for want of a better word, integrity. You can approach them and you can talk to them collaboratively, and there may be sponsorship and other opportunities with those media outlets. People have to make money, but there is also that kind of editorial component to them. And so I think that when it comes to influencers, we've certainly seen the rise of that. I think that we're also seeing a shift towards trusted kind of sources. And I think that sort of spans across media outlets. People make their own judgment about the podcast they're listening to, and whether they're trying to sell them something, or whether the blog that they're reading is sponsored. The contributed content that they're reading is sponsored, etc. It's certainly becoming more difficult to figure out where the boundaries are. It's something that we're trying to do all of the time. And at the same time, I think it's never been more important to be a trusted media brand, and we've seen that benefit people like the New York Times and the National. We've just done a survey of senior comms people, for example, and without a doubt, the international media outlets, the national media outlets, continue to be the most trusted brands, and other very smaller, more partial, going through to influencers, are less trusted, as you would expect.
Yeah, and I think this is, as you pointed out, this is a very difficult category to draw lines around, right? And so for those of you who've not seen what Tellum does, Tellum is a wonderful database that contains all the information of journalists moving from one company to another. And so that database gives them a bird's eye view as to what's going on in this space in terms of trends. They can also see what new job positions are coming up, where demand is and where the supply is as well. So to kind of bring this back to influencers again, how would you how would you think about the qualifications? And I don't mean that from a certification point of view, but what qualifies someone who may be an influencer, who has a community that he or she serves? How does that person, where does that person fit in a database like yours?
It goes back to being pitchable, and it's very difficult. There are gray areas and there are judgment calls. I think this is an interesting segment of journalism as well, because we're seeing journalists not just in Asia but elsewhere, in Asia Pacific region, who will set up as brands on their own. Can you, as a PR professional and a representative of a brand or a corporate communicator, can you talk to that person? Are they talking to an audience, or are they simply on Instagram and going to request money?
I like that distinction as as someone who's pitchable. I think that's a really good starting point to frame that. Anita, at your work at CUNY, have you seen conversations around this? How does the industry deal with the rise of influencers in a space like this?
Well, the interesting thing is it feels like 2010 all over again, right? With, the conversation, who's a blogger, who's a journalist? How do we differentiate? Do we have to differentiate at all? So it's kind of funny I feel kind of old now, that I feel like history is kind of repeating itself. I think the thing about these things that are so hard to distinguish with some kind of, red line in the middle is they are not black and white, right? There are plenty of shades of gray that you're actually talking about. I mean, a journalist is not a journalist, right? A journalist who does investigative work at the New York Times is very different from someone who writes, I don't know, sensational little society stories for the Daily Mail. An influencer or kind of creator who writes an analytics piece about some kind of political, happening, or some kind of economic trend on a newsletter they started, is not the same like an influencer or creator who sells shampoo on Instagram. So I'm saying that these labels are sometimes very misleading, and I think are sometimes used by incumbents and legacy organizations to kind of dismantle credibility of potential competitors. So I'm just going to say that I think that actually, I think when it really comes to influencers and what we mean by the sense of the word, like, you know, the guy on Instagram selling merchandise, I actually feel we all know that this is not, most of that is not going to be journalism. And I do feel if someone is, you know, starting something on their own without the media organization and producing some kind of value-driven qualitative journalism or investigative work, they can be just as trusted as a legacy organization, sometimes even more, which is, by the way, something that we're seeing happening now. If you think again about the New York Times, they pretty much hired the whole group of former editors-in-chief at some of the large digital media brands on the US East Coast. I mean, Ezra Klein left Vox to join the New York Times. Kara Swisher joined the New York Times. Ben Smith joined the New York Times. Why is the Times doing that? Because they understand that their trust as a brand is also rooted in the trust that their heads and their people show to the audience. So that's why they are kind of hiring that talent. They understood that they are in the talent business ultimately.
Yeah, that's right. And this is, you know, in a way, this kind of goes back to what live TV news was all about. You hired a high profile anchor with a big brand name to drive, you know, viewership onto your show. And I think, you know, I think that's an important conversation to have. But I like your point that this is also a situation where you have legacy media companies trying to dismantle credibility. Which is it's a great verb to use because I think it really demonstrates how close this industry can be sometimes. You know, but then you look at someone like Ben Thompson's Stratechery, for example, right? Very profitable business, one-man show with great ideas and great analysis, and still very often, you know, you find a lot of journalists who say, well, you know, he's a business analyst, he's a consultant, he's not a journalist. Sorry. So these things do still come up, and it's really quite frustrating to see sometimes. But I'm wondering also, you know, does your program at CUNY, you know, is there flexibility in the way you consider someone for the programs that you run? But also, you know, if we were to take that a step further, how can we as an industry build bridges to the influencer community over the next year?
Well, I mean, I can tell you that we at CUNY, so the part of the school that I run at CUNY is everything that's like not for credit. So I'm not responsible for kind of the formal MAs, where sometimes you have less flexibility because the state or the country government basically says, oh, someone needs to have a bachelor degree in this and that field to be eligible. So it's not like always up to the university itself. But the things that I do are all, you know, my team runs programs that are executive programs, professional development programs, entrepreneurial certificates. So we have more flexibility in who we admit. So I can tell you that, for example, we are kind of disrupting the field a little bit by not asking for master's degrees or bachelor's degrees. If someone with journalistic experience and credibility and a great track record and great recommendation comes and has only finished, you know, a community college and never gone to university, we would totally accept that person if that person is great. If someone comes and has spent the first 20 years, you know, running their own small business and then, you know, discovered their love for journalism and, you know, went to J school and then wants to do one of our entrepreneurial programs and that person is great, we totally admit that person. So we, I think, are pretty untraditional in the way that we kind of, you know, break up these lines that have been, these walls that have been built around journalism and what is journalism and what isn't journalism. But even that being said, even for us, we are a journalism school after all. So we are not, you know, we don't see ourselves, we don't see our mission as educating and supporting marketing professionals in consumer brand companies. We don't see our mission in training communication professionals in oil and gas. We focus on media companies, broadly speaking. Again, there is also, you know, thousands of blurry lines here. What if someone works at Netflix? What if someone works in the agency arm of the Washington Post? Thousands of difficult decisions to make. But broadly speaking, we say if someone works in a media organization or wants to or is starting a journalistic venture that at the core of its value proposition wants to produce or accelerate or distribute journalism, then we would consider them as a participant or a student in our programs.
Very good. I'm going to jump to our first question from the audience. And I think this is something that, Rama, you have a strong opinion on. Sebastian Wijaya is asking, is paid news a thing of the past? What strategies can we employ to get people to pay for quality news in media beyond just free headlines that's been given out? I think, Rama, again, given your experience in this space, you've spent a lot of time thinking about how to monetize an audience. And especially, I like to hear your perspective on this because you come from a B2B community, which has, in my mind, far more compelling monetization options than a B2C play. What do you think here?
Yeah, so as you said, most of the times, almost a decade, we actually monetize not from the content business, no advertising, none of that. But we just started to actually do a subscription model where people actually, so we have two models where people can pay per article that they want to read, and we do a monthly subscription as well. This is a very recent endeavor that we just launched, I think, like 2 months back. And one of the things we learned, and one of the major reasons why we did it, is because we believe that our content is not available elsewhere. And that's not necessarily the case when it comes to mainstream news, like election news. You can read it everywhere else. Everyone will have this exact same content, right? And it's very hard to monetize, that type of content. And it's very easy if you have a very unique kind of original content. It's very much a Netflix kind of approach where we actually invest time and capital to produce a very, very high quality content, and then we actually we expect people to pay for it, and they do, right? I think that's the case. And it's I'm on the board for the Indonesian Digital Association as well, and it's an association for some of the largest media companies in Indonesia. And it is a challenge for traditional media companies to adopt the business model because they're for more than half a century they've been depending on political news, economy news that aren't exactly unique, right? And it's very hard to, at least in this day and age of the internet, it's very hard to monetize from that. But I believe that you can monetize. People are willing to pay for content as long as you have a unique content. Only you can deliver it, and you do a very good job in delivering it. High quality kind of work.
That is spot on advice. Yeah. So to summarize what you said there, and I think that's an important thing to keep in mind, that the only way to survive if you're in a B2C space, especially, if you're going to try to survive, you need to have a brand that stands out from everything else that's out there and to deliver content that is not available anywhere else. If you're going to go into the space and do whatever to do what everyone else is doing, you're going to struggle with that.
Correct.
So, tell me a little bit more, Rama, about some of the changes that you've made to the business this year. This has not been an easy year for your kind of work as well, right? What were some of the big pivots that you had to make along the way to keep the business going?
Yeah, so our main business model is B2B, and being the pandemic really impact the industry and really impact all of our clients. It impacts us in terms of reducing the revenue they could give to us. So we've actually had the plan for subscription model, I think, for 2 years now. We've been talking and talking and talking, and then the pandemic kind of, let's do this, let's launch this, and let's execute. So we invested quite heavily in developing the platform. We partner with some of the best players in the region, and then we launch it. And it's a I wouldn't say it's a pivot because both business model are still working. And our B2B business model, in case you don't know, we have a platform. So we use the content to kind of build the community of technology enthusiasts, and then we use a product approach in a way that we know that our clients, our corporate clients, have a need to connect with our community of readership. That's where we built the platform, and we monetize from there, which is very untraditional way for a media company. That's why we never claim we're a media company, although the media part is actually, we have an editor-in-chief, we have editorial team, we have research team and all that, but we're not a media company, which is it surprises most people. But it is something that at the end of the day we have to solve problems. That's how we can make money. So regardless, that's from the media part, from the platform part, from the research part, we it's a we're a startup, so we try to think as a startup, not to be bound with whatever works in the past, and we try to do things our way, and so far it works quite well. So hopefully it will sustain in the next few years.
Yeah, that's great to hear. I think, in a year like this, a lot of companies are doubling down on a lot of the tech debt that they've accumulated over the last few years, and not putting together the right tech stack for what they needed to do. And I think a year like this is a good chance to reset that within the organization itself. Exactly. And so, Tim, have you seen some of these changes play out on your side of things, where where companies are now spending this year doubling down on getting the technology right behind the scenes? Have you seen any new roles?
I think that's certainly the case. I think going back to the point that Rama was just making about the models that work, we've seen over a number of years experimentation on those models. What's happened, and we were talking about B2B earlier on, where the model was increasingly awards and events and those kind of things. They've had a significant portion of their revenue taken away. We've seen advertising budgets cut. The subscription model appears to be a model that works very well. It's our model. We do provide news and newsletters, but we're a subscription service. I was talking to a board member from New Zealand's largest independent digital publisher around that, and the point is you've got to cover the salary bill, right? And subscription, if you have the attention, you have the credibility, you have the right kind of content, you can cover that salary bill. On the technical debt, I think that legacy media companies, when I say, well, traditional media companies is a better way to put it. Traditional media companies have struggled with that. I mean, they've been large. It's been hard for them to adjust. They're kind of like tankers dealing with technology. Smaller, newer media outlets are often more technically savvy, but it entirely depends on what you're trying to achieve. I was listening to our Malaysia team interviewing a podcaster and blogger yesterday who's got a small climbing, mountaineering focused publication. She's very open to collaborations. She's got a very low cost base. Those collaborations pay for the content. It really depends on what you're trying to achieve. So I agree with you. I think there is an awakening on technical investment, but it really depends on what you're about, what your business model is, and how you're intending to capture attention and serve those clients, and then kind of make money from that.
There's a good question here in the Q&A box, and Tim, this is going to be for you. Will there be greater demand for freelance journalists in the future? And I think related to that, the same person who is anonymous, he or she didn't provide a name. How can a journalist, especially those who've lost jobs this year, best position themselves in a post-pandemic world? I think Tim, you've seen a lot of transfers from the freelance world into established newsrooms and vice versa, right? What have you seen in this space, and what do you think are going to be some of the key trends for freelancers next year?
As you know from talking with Heikel, we've seen a significant increase in the number of freelancers. If I just did a search on freelancers for the last couple of weeks, and number of people who've become freelancer moving from traditional outlets, a lot of those are down to the structural changes that we've talked about. They're of necessity. There's also the emergence of the kind of gig economy the lifestyle, if you like, and freelance is not just contained to media. It's also a significant and growing portion of the work that PR agencies and marketing firms need to do. They need content creators. Companies need corporate journalists. So I see that as a growing segment. It's a difficult one for us to manage. We follow media freelancers, and oftentimes those freelance journalists may well work for corporates, and they may work for brands and may produce content for other organizations across their owned channels. So I just think that there will be more of that, and down individual skill sets. We've just, this week actually, we're launching a job site, a jobs board, something that we were planning to do anyway. We had, and we have always run newsletters with jobs for journalists and for PRs, and we saw there's a significant increase in demand for that. For something for APAC that can capture all the opportunities that are available. And for us, we're having the media category, the PR category, and media related, which is, if you like, it's people who have skill sets that may be in SEO, they may be in video production, they may be in podcasting. So I think that in keeping with other parts of the economy that have become fragmented and digitally disrupted, we're bound to see more people either opting to or being forced to freelance and learn new skills.
I think that's a great point, Tim, because I think very often when we talk about freelance journalists, we're only thinking about freelance reporting, and we forget that there are a whole bunch of other sets of skills that could come together with that, as you said, with SEO, for example, with product design, for example. Like a lot of these are often neglected and forgotten, right? So Anita, you also, you put some thought to this as well around freelancers. I think, freelancers tend to be the underclass of what drives the media industry. It's the Uber class of workers that we don't think enough about or support. What do you think are some of the gaps that need to be addressed with regard to freelancers? Because I think all media companies rely on freelancers to a large degree, whether they want to admit it or not.
Yeah, I actually think it's one thing that we're seeing is a really interesting trend, and partly, and that is the sad part about that trend, somehow again accelerated through the pandemic. But we see that plenty of the journalists who are now leaving newsrooms because they were laid off, or the stress has just gotten too much, or the work environment is just not anymore what they want, or because they are call them millennials or whatever you might call this generation, but the values that they follow are just not aligned with the values of the organization. We see this clash of civilizations all the time. I literally have conversations pretty much every day with someone in their, somewhere between the late 20s and mid 30s saying, the way that people are led in my organization, I'm just not going to put up with that any longer. The lack of freedom, of flexibility that is there, the lack of career opportunities. So I will say that a certain generation entering the industry, not just the media industry, but broadly speaking, the workforce also has become more demanding. And I think to a big extent, that's a good thing. What we're seeing is that leads to many, many journalists kind of redefining what freelancing means for them. Because frankly, freelancing, unless you're one of the top players in that game, means a lot of sales pitches, a lot of unanswered emails, a lot of phone calls that are not comfortable. So it's not, unless you're like top of the game, it's not an easy business if your only business model is someone pays you for pieces of content that you have to sell them piece by piece. Now, what we are seeing, and I can share it in the chat afterwards, we launched an entrepreneurial program that's called the Entrepreneurial Journalism Creators Program, that is actually focused on giving freelancers the skills they need to actually make a business out of what they are doing. And we were absolutely blown away by that. We launched the first cohort right now. We had admissions over the summer. We were blown away by the level of interest of people saying, I want to start something, but I don't want to buy into this kind of Silicon Valley-esque idea of, oh, it needs to be big and scale, and then I'm going to sell it to a venture capitalist, and it's somehow techy. They want to make a living telling the stories of a community. That is what they want. They don't want to have like 25 employees. They don't want to take on giant mortgages for that. They want to make a living, and usually how they make a living is with a diversified revenue portfolio where people paying them for content is just part of the calculation. There is consulting, there is sometimes advisory boards, sometimes there is a membership opportunity there, sometimes it's subscriptions or paid content, sometimes it's advertising, sponsorships, event moderations, you name it. But we see a lot of development there. This is not going to solve all the issues that the industry has, mind you. I mean, there is a danger in this. We as an industry are very prone to believing in silver bullets that are going to solve everything for us. This is not the silver bullet, mind you. But this is a really encouraging trend. And if we, if you just think that if there are 100 people each year that are telling the stories that have before that been untold, that are telling the stories of a community that before that have been not been served, that is going to be impactful for journalism and for these communities.
I love that. That's a hope that I have for this industry, right? I think that media needs to be niche. It needs to be small, it needs to be nimble, it needs to be what Tim referred to as micro media organizations. And I love the creators program that you put together, Anita, because I think that is exactly the pinpoint intervention that's needed. And I like what you were saying, that that through this application process you came to see what people wanted, which I think is really, really quite powerful. What do you think is possible, like from an industry approach, that if we all kind of got our acts together and we all focused on trying to support that group of people, what would be some of the things that we need to get done to make sure that they have a chance of succeeding next year?
I'm you know me, Alan, and I'm a big optimist overall for the future of news, but I'm not a big optimist in the sense of that I think that at some point the big legacy organizations will be like, oh, these poor creators, we should take better care of them. That's not going to happen, I think. Why should legacy organizations do that? It's kind of emerging competition that's more nimble, that's dangerous for them. That's also sometimes, as I said, maybe somehow frowned upon. These are not real journalists. They are kind of bloggers or influencers or whatever it is. So I don't think we can, I don't think there is, it makes sense to wait for the large players in the media industry to kind of adopt these creators, because we all know the truth, right? Media organizations, especially the large media organizations, have not been friendliest to freelancers as is. So why should they suddenly kind of wake up and be like, oh, we're going to help them? But what I do feel, the ecosystem is not just large media organizations. The ecosystem is universities. The ecosystem is tech players. The ecosystem is communication agencies. The ecosystem is technology companies providing infrastructure and tech stacks. The ecosystem is companies that usually, sponsor events or foundations and philanthropy that care for social impact and freedom of information and quality of journalism. And that part of the ecosystem, I think, has realized that the large legacy news organization is not the only unit that's worth protecting and supporting and saving. Journalism is what's worth protecting and supporting and saving. And sometimes this journalism will be done in a giant newsroom, but sometimes it will be done by one person sitting in front of the laptop at 11 p.m. on a Friday evening and doing some investigative work that no one else does in their region. And I think once we understand that what we are trying to save and support is not institutions, what we are trying to save and support is journalism, I think that will make the picture a bit clearer.
And maybe you can take this question as well, Anita. Someone's asking, what is the likelihood of increased support for news gathering activity by public spirited foundations and other nonprofit organizations? Is there more money going into the space coming from NGOs, foundations, family funds, trusts? Have you seen an increase, or would you say it's kind of about the same?
I mean, I can tell you that I come from a region in the world where philanthropic journalism funding is pretty rare. No, I mean, Europe, it's pretty rare. Right. And then coming to the US, it feels like, oh my God, millions are flowing. And that is very unique compared to Europe. And I know it's also unique compared to Asia. But I will, and yes, there is more. I think with the understanding that the loss of local media, especially, and the loss of community media leads to a deterioration in trust, and that deterioration in trust and that decline in trust has immediate impact on the society as a whole, on political decisions, on the health, the democratic health of a society overall. So I think there is, I hope, and I feel, I see that somehow, there is kind of an increased understanding that journalism is not just, another industry doing some stuff, but that it's a super important element of democracy. So I do feel that foundations are stepping up there, and they have stepped up in the past as well. But they are stepping up still in a pretty old-fashioned way. So they are not used to supporting nimble units of one. They are not used to supporting disruptive innovation. Foundations and philanthropy. Philanthropy's bet is playing it safe. It's kind of the opposite of venture capital in a way.
That's true.
So the question that I've been thinking about a lot and talking about a lot with my network is there something between philanthropy and venture capital? Is there something that recognizes risk capital, but doesn't need to bet on hockey stick returns? Is there a way to support those nimble, small, disruptive units of journalism without unrealistic revenue assumptions for the next 2 or 5 years?
Very good. Rama, I'm sure you've put a lot of thought into this one. Having spoken to all sorts of investors over the years, you've spoken to VCs, obviously, private equity, I'm sure as well. I mean, is there that middle ground there that could help fund independent, army of one type of journalism projects or organizations?
I mean, I'm talking from an Indonesian perspective. I think it's not going to be as easy as it would in the United States, which is more mature. In Indonesia, I see very small amount of money in terms of philanthropy to media organizations. There are existing ones, of course, and they're quite substantial, but there's not a lot, right? So it's very not as mature as the U.S. In terms to venture capital, of course, at the end of the day, Indonesia is one of the fastest growing technology industry economy in the world. So we're at that stage, rather early stage. I mean, not too early, but we're at the stage where everyone's trying to monetize. And, you can see even in Indonesia, there's a lot of new generation of media companies receive all these fundings from, from venture capital companies, and they're growing incredibly fast. But at the end of the day, it's not about the VC supporting, good journalism or media. It's about them generating, return on their investments, right? And I think that's the silver lining where, as a media company, we have to be able to ensure that we generate good, high quality content, integrity, and adapting with the market as well, which I always call integrity plus personality, and get good returns to your investors and grow and recruit more people, become scalable, and most importantly, sustainable as a business. And that's the only way you can survive as a media company. And you don't want to be too dependent on capital funding from investors or any external sources, grants, or what have you. If you can be sustainable, that's always the preferred way to go.
Exactly. We've got a question that I guess is on everyone's minds at some point, or some level at least. Mohammed Amir is asking, what is the future of print media, which finds itself behind times due to news channels and websites providing minute by minute kind of coverage? Is what he's asking. Tim, can I go to you for that one? I think you've seen a lot of changes in this space as well. Maybe if you could talk about it from a comms perspective, right? If you were a comms person, are these newspapers still pitchable? To use your framework, is the value of that pitch the same as what it would be if you were to, pitch to a website, that's providing a faster service?
I think from a commerce perspective, again, it always depends what you're trying to achieve. If you're trying to achieve a particular niche audience and reach a niche audience on a particular topic, you may go down a different route. But I think, say we've literally just pulled all the raw data together on a survey of senior comms people from across Asia Pacific region, and what the traditional news media still provides is a trusted news source. It's news sources of record, whether those are national or international, and in many ways we've seen this anyway in consumption habits of people gravitating towards trusted news brands in this era of fake news. So their role is incredibly important. The challenges they have, I think they're still wrestling with. Their structural challenges, how they report, what kind of reporting. So we were talking about news gathering before, and yet when you talk to people within these news organizations, often they're scraping Twitter for the latest piece of information. They're getting it from other sources that could be and are, fake, potentially fake news sources. So in terms of the importance to the comms community, I think they're still very important, and particularly to older generations of the comms community. And you will still find that a good article in a quality daily newspaper is considered to be very important. Likewise, the news wires like Bloomberg, Reuters, and others, which are growing in importance. The challenge, of course, is getting people to buy the papers and getting people's attention. And I think it's really interesting to see what's going on in Australia right now, where the push to get the social media platforms and who have the consumer attention and who are providing the content to the consumer for free to pay for that content and pay those traditional media platforms. It'll be interesting to see how that plays out. And then, it really is market by market, I think, as well in Southeast Asia, depending on sort of what the consumption patterns are. But for sure, everything's going mobile, and so they have to have mobile strategies, right?
Absolutely. So I want to keep the theme of an optimistic view of the world going, to take Anita's point here from earlier. And I'm also mindful of the time. We are coming up to the top of the hour, and I just want to make sure that we still have time for some of the Q&A stuff. But if I could go around and ask all of you, starting with you, Anita, what is the one big opportunity for next year? Now that COVID is what it is, we all have a pretty good estimate of life under COVID. What is your view of an opportunity that you think needs to be tackled next year?
I think one thing that has become very clear this year is that news organizations that don't have a direct rapport and communication channel and a true and authentic audience engagement strategy, organizations that are very far to understand what their audiences need, what fears and hopes they have, what drives them, what they talk about at the kitchen table. Organizations that don't have that understanding, that data, that relationship, and that don't care about that data are faring really bad in terms of, in the subscription economy or membership economy. It's not at all surprising, right? Because if you want someone to buy your product, to support you with money or anything else, to advocate for you with other potential users, but you don't really care for that person, that is not a very fruitful relationship. And none of us would feel respected or appreciated if we were treated that way by an organization. Now, media traditionally has been not great in treating their audiences as, respected members of the community. And I think, and I do hope that finally, 2020 is the year when that changes. And it does. I see it happen for many, many small, especially local organizations. I see that what brought them through the pandemic is their laser sharp focus on their communities. And then they saw increases in subscription revenue and in membership revenues. And I hope, and I do see some positive signs that some of the larger organizations are also understanding that this is key to a successful collaboration with their audiences in the future.
I like that you say that. At Splice, Rishad and I spend a lot of time talking about not just DTC, direct to consumer, but direct to true fans. So what would that look like if we had to think of our universe as being only serving 100 true fans of Splice? What would that be like in terms of a relationship? So I think that's kind of to your point, and I definitely see the value in it. I like that you're saying also that, if we still haven't figured this out next year, that's still going to be it's going to be a big problem going forward, right? Rama, what do you think?
Yeah, I think that's very spot on what Anita said. That I totally agree that brands, social media brands, they've been around for a long time, so they feel they're above the consumer, and that's not necessarily the case. The past decade, I think, showed, the internet showed that you have to be able to be more understanding, more empathetic, more communicative, more interactive with your readership, and not just, most of these, older kind of traditional media companies, you read what I tell you to read. That's not going to work this time around. And I think one of the things that I also want to emphasize is the absence of personality for each of these media brands. And I'm not talking about, it has to be centered around the CEO or whoever. I mean, it's just the absence of personality for each brand. And one of the reasons why influencer is so popular these days is, of course, if you want to consider them as a media organization, micro media organization, they still have to have that integrity. That's a big part of being a media, no matter how small you are, no matter how big you are. But then they add the personality level layer, and people love you for who you are, even if you're talking about the exact same thing with everyone else. You're talking about it from your own perspective, from your own angle, with your own language, and people can relate to that. And I think that tells a lot about the generation these days. They don't want you to talk down to them. They want to be on the same level. We're friends, we're equal. Tell me about it, and tell me about it in a language that I would understand. I want you to wear the same things that I wear, to be as goofy as I am, and to be relatable on that sense. And I think that's the number one that I think is going to be changing after the pandemic. The number two is the rise of not the rise. I mean, more and more media organizations is trying to get out of the advertising business model. This is something, it's not entirely new. It's been around for what, 5-10 years, but it's very hard. I understand it is still big money. It's very hard to walk away from that amount of money on the table, and but it is becoming more and more of an effort for some of the large media companies, at least in Indonesia. They are considering alternative ways to actually make money. Getting out of the Google, Facebook, Twitter kind of world, because it is not sustainable. Advertising in general is, it's very hard to make it sustain and scale as well. So I think that's one of the things that I would really love to see in 2021. For anyone to come up with a solution for media companies to make money, outside of the advertising business model.
Yeah, I think that's I like your point about being relatable. I think this is going to be something that becomes increasingly important. I think we've seen a lot of this stuff happening in the influencer space, where instead of the word relatable, the word is being authentic, and so therefore you are able to build a relationship and a connection with your audience. Tim, what's your opportunity for next year?
It's really interesting. We're talking about the future of journalism, and in many ways journalism's come under attack in so many different ways. And you would think in the States, for example, as a First Amendment sort of right, that journalism wouldn't be attacked in the way that it has been attacked over the last few years. And I think in many ways we were talking about the difference between a media outlet and an influencer, and people wanting to get out there and tell truth and talk to, and tell stories and serve communities with information and journalistic principles. And it feels that there's, at least from what I can see, there are a number of amazing new and well-established and media outlets that seem to be sustainable and good business models serving communities with really high quality journalism. And I think we shouldn't forget that that is going on, and that these outlets are beginning to flourish. And secondly, I think, you know, you can always, I trained as a biomedia journalist in the days when that was trendy, when I was carrying a reel-to-reel tape recorder with 10 minutes of tape and a Betacam. And you needed to sort of work out just to be able to do that. And that was considered as a democratizer of news. There's so much you can do now with a hand phone, that the opportunities, and that we can all do from home, that we can do on Zoom, that there are a huge plethora of opportunities to be explored, and a whole variety of different models depending on your objectives and the communities you want to serve. So I'm actually really excited about next year. I'm cautiously optimistic about next year, and from an economic perspective, and I'm hoping that we'll continue to see people test boundaries, try new models, serve their communities in different ways, and that's across all of the media outlets.
Okay, well, so I'm just looking at the Q&A box here. I think in answering those, you know, in your answers there, I think we've answered a whole bunch of questions here. There are a lot of people who are asking, oh, you know, what happens if media is in decline? How do we turn that around? What is the role of online media? What is the current situation like? And how does it turn around? Where does the readership base go in the future? I think we've all kind of answered that in the last 3 minutes alone, which is fantastic to see. I feel like my job here is done. If there is one last question, I'd be happy to kind of pop that in. If not, actually, let me see here. No, feel free to drop in your final questions here so we can get to them. If not, in the meantime, you know, I've got a question. So something that I care a lot about, which is diversity in media. And I think that COVID has taught all of us how to use technology better. The very fact that the three of us here are now in a conversation with 53 other people around the world, sitting around our computers and with cameras, says a lot about our ability to tap a wider set of sources, for one, but also to be able to hire and work with people of more diversity than we've ever seen before. What are some of the things that are needed to encourage that going forward into next year? Anita, do you have a particular view on that one?
Well, I think it's really interesting, Alan. One of my pet peeves was always to try to understand why there is such a big divide between, you know, kind of the journalism ecosystem in Asia, in Europe, in the US, in LATAM. It's really interesting because, like you said, we should be so connected. We are, if you look at this panel here and the conversations all of us have. But I think part of the reason is that kind of the trade associations and community networks and the conferences and all these things have been so locally focused, right? There's always the sponsors have been locally focused, the organizers have been locally focused. I think what I'm seeing now is because it becomes so easy to just kind of have online events or online programs where you have participants as well as teachers from every part of the world. That is such a huge opportunity. And I think ultimately it's just a little bit of a mindset change. And I can tell you that even for me, who I think has a relatively international network, it is a mindset change, right? Because now when I think, okay, we're starting this new entrepreneurial program, I try to not go to my go-to people only who I ask to give, you know, guest lectures and so forth. I try to think who's in Australia who might be amazing to talk about product, who's in Germany who might be amazing to talk about branding. And it makes the programs better. I can tell you one of the exciting things is that I see is, yes, you need some kind of local connection as well and some local insights. But if you become more diverse when it comes to the student body and the professor side of things, actually the programs and the convenings that you have become more fruitful and inspiring.
Absolutely. I think in this time we have no excuse not to reach out, around the world and to connect and to have better conversations with everyone. Rama?
Yeah, I think it's very interesting as well. I had this discussion on my LinkedIn a few weeks ago, with, everyone working from home, how likely are you for, if you're a founder or CEO of a company, how more likely are you to hire someone outside of Indonesia or outside of the country you're in? And everyone was quite excited, and it kind of surprises them. I mean, yeah, why didn't I think of that before? I mean, everyone's working from home anyway, and of course, there's the whole tax issue, money going outside of the country, especially in Indonesia. If we pay someone outside the country, that's a whole. There's a quite a bit of a hassle, but it's still worth it because it gives you more of an international knowledge in terms of building whatever it is that you're building, an international perspective in your product, for example, like like Nita said. And I ended up actually where we are hiring, and I talked to well, he's an Indonesian guy, but he's based out of Japan, one based out of Malaysia as well. I mean, it's really it's really open now. We are, accidentally becoming more and more kind of a global economy in its true sense, because it was never a global role before, but now once apparently it takes a pandemic to be able to make people see that you can actually hire from anywhere, right?
I think it takes a pandemic that forces all of us to sit at home and look into our little cameras on our big screens.
Yeah.
Tim, what do you think?
I agree with that. I just we were talking about diversity there. It just brought me back to something I was involved with when I was in PR, which was I worked as a journalist at Bloomberg, but I also worked and did PR for Bloomberg, which was just increasing female representation in news stories and news coverage. And this is a particular kind of focus area. And it really came from a journalist at Bloomberg looking at the amount of times he'd, in a year, that he'd quoted female spokespeople, albeit in the corporate and financial space. And it was something like 15% of the people he'd quoted were women. And this created and sparked, Anita may well be familiar with this, a sort of a broader discussion and then a sort of formal programs to actually turn that on its head. And I think it's encouraging and interesting, and to be encouraged for journalists everywhere to think about the audiences they're representing in their coverage, and I think it's kind of very heartening to see. And of course, on a broader perspective, we're seeing a lot more, we carry a lot of media requests. That is, journalists come to us and say, we're writing on this or that, and inviting submissions from spokespeople. And ESG, so corporate environmental sustainability and governance, is a huge issue, and diversity of experience, of gender, geography, and life experience is an incredibly important part of ESG. So again, I think it's an area I'm excited about for this coming year, and it's an area that's being directly related now to the way that companies are valued and their share price, which I think is very important.
Excellent. All right, we're going to take one last question from the Q&A box. John Simmons is asking, while responsible news media seem to be facing shrinkage in staff and resources, propaganda influencers seem to be growing in their outreach. How do the panelists feel about the challenge of coexisting with these special interest voices, both at home and overseas? Tim, why don't you take that one first?
And again, we see some segments of the media growing and some not. And if you take some of the news wires, and I use the example of Bloomberg there, these are not necessarily shrinking, but they're becoming very, very important brands, and they provide a very important contribution to reporting in the community. We would be very careful in who we include in our platform. And when it comes to fake news, and to sort of unsubstantiated sort of claims and, if you like, non-reporting, we wouldn't include it in the platform. So I think that's probably a cutoff from our perspective. Obviously, we don't take sides. We are an intermediary between PRs and media, and yet it's all about trusted editorial sources for us. So we wouldn't really include them. And I think, you know, I can understand the frustration that journalists and media will feel when some of these stories gain traction. But you know, we've seen in all the research that trust in government sources has gone down, and I think, you know, you have to and you know, it's quite often the source of the information is coming from senior people in government.
Excellent. Rama?
Yeah, this is a major issue that we also face in Indonesia, where, you know, especially in the political, you know, issue, there's a lot of, you know, all these Twitter accounts, like thousands of them, reporting, you know, like in coordination of, you know, for a certain agenda. And as much as I would like to take responsibility for this, I think it's the responsibility for the platform owners, you know, Facebook, Twitter, Google, and this is, I mean, I know they are, you know, they're doing a few things to tackle this issue, but for me, at least from my my citizen perspective, it's not enough because it's still happening around us. I see it happen, you know, every day. So I think, you know, everyone needs to do more. What the answer is, I have no idea. I think that's what happened when, you know, when I talked earlier about integrity and personality is, you know, relates better to the current audience, the millennials or the Gen Z. This is what happens if you remove the integrity part. They just follow the personality, but that particular personality, you don't know who they are. You don't know what kind of credential they have, their background, their motivation, their agenda, because there's no integrity behind it, but you like it because of the personality. This is what happens.
And Anita, over to you for your final remarks as well, before we close this off.
Well, I mean, it's a big issue that we could probably spend another 1.5 hours talking about. One thing that I will say is, I mean, that completely builds on what Rama and Tim said. This is an ecosystem problem. This is not a problem that you can solve by just tackling it from one side. This is a problem where the big tech platforms and communication platforms have to be involved and have to stand up and take a certain responsibility. It's a question that media organizations, I think, have to tackle, because it also means that for whatever reason, their content is not gaining as much traction. So you, as a media organization, you need to understand why that is the case, and you need to be as close. Again, we are at the audience question. You need to be so close to your audience that you can make sure that they trust you and that they kind of, you know, trust your journalistic content. But then third, I think it's also an issue for society as a whole. I think it's a question that every single person has to think about. Who do they support with their subscription fees? Who do they support with, you know, what kind of newspaper they buy, or what kind of, you know, digital service they subscribe to? I think there is a certain societal responsibility, both for every single person, as well as for politicians, as well as for philanthropy, as well as for funders in that space.
Very, very thoughtful. Thank you so much, Anita. Thank you, Tim, and thank you, Rama. You've given all of us plenty to think about, and you know, I've got a whole bunch of notes here that I'm going to go read right after this call. Thank you so much for your insights and being so thoughtful in the way you've expressed all of them. Marilyn, I'm going to hand this back to you.
What an engaging, interesting, and insightful discussion. I want to thank you again to all our distinguished speaker and moderator today, Rama Mayu Iyer, Tim Williamson, Anita Selina, and Alan Sun. The Center is delighted to have hosted such an important discussion. Thank you as well to our viewers for attending this East West Center Seminars live webinar. Finally, please tune in for our next webinar in 2021. More details will be coming soon. Have a happy and peaceful holiday season. To everyone, mahalo and aloha. Thank you.